Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the European Parliament here in Strasbourg. My name is Maria, and the single market has just turned 30. Since its creation in 1930, the single market has helped to make everyday life easier for people and businesses, fueling with jobs and growth across the EU. To discuss what lies ahead for one of the greatest achievements of the European Union, I am joined today by Ms. Anna Cavazzini, the Chair of Parliament's Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection. Welcome, Ms. Cavazzini.
Hello.
Thank you for your time today. So before we get underway with the interview, I'd like our audience who are live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube to send us your questions and comments, and I'll try to put as many as possible to my guest in the next half an hour or so. So, Ms. Cavazzini, let's start. What is the current state of the European single market?
Yeah, here in Strasbourg we just celebrated the 30 years of the single market, and when you listen to the debate in plenary, you saw really every member of the European Parliament talked about the big achievements. You know, like in the last 30 years, Europe grew together, and with these 4 freedoms, like persons can move freely, capital, products, and so on. It is really, we can say European integration was achieved, was put forward, and I think this is really one of the biggest achievements of the internal market.
And what are the main benefits of the single market, and how has it transformed the European Union?
Yeah, instead of 50,000 different national norms and standards, instead of big customs declarations, European companies can just sell their products all over Europe, and we as consumers, we profit from more choice, but also from lower prices, next to the fact that, of course, we also can move freely, work, study, live everywhere in the European Union. And I think this was, of course, the whole idea of founding the single market, to leverage this economic prosperity. But I would say there's much more than the economic side to the single market, especially in the last years. We managed to also really increase with our EU legislation that we're doing in this parliament, the product standards, for example, to make sure all the products are safe. All the products really have very high standards in the European Union. Or to abolish roaming, so that consumers all over the European Union can use their cell phone as if at home. Yeah. So a lot of different legislations for the internal market safe are actually good for the consumers and the business.
Yeah, it's important that you mention roaming, for example, because many of the citizens don't know that this legislation comes from the European Union, indeed. So you mentioned the main benefits. We will discuss about it later on as well. But on the contrary, what are the most pressing challenges?
I would say, of course, at the moment, we have this overall challenge that is the war in Ukraine, high energy prices, inflation that are having a lot of impact on businesses and consumers in the European Union. We saw that, especially during the pandemic, the last big crisis before the war, supply chains were interrupted and borders were closed again because of the virus that doesn't really stop at the border. So the internal market always basically, I think, needs to react to those crises, needs to evolve. And at the end, I would say the single market and its tools are always the solution, or can be the solution to the different challenges we face in the European Union. But I would say in general, the state of the single market is quite good, because in the last years we really got rid of a lot of barriers in the European Union, and I think the internal market is really almost complete, if you would say so.
And what would be the next steps, or, for example, how would you imagine celebrating the 50 years of the single market?
I think when you look at the different challenges, we are already on a good way. But we could still accelerate some of our policy making when it comes to the internal market. For example, one of the biggest challenges for me is the climate crisis. And we have put forward some interesting legislation that will help to fight the climate crisis. For example, the common charger, where we will save resources in the future because we don't need 50 different cables anymore. Or we will have very soon the right to repair that will make it easier to repair our products and not just throw them away. But we need to accelerate our green transition also when it comes to the internal market and using it as a tool. Second issue, I would say, what I would like to see in 50 years single market is that with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, we also started to regulate the digital single market and to regulate the big platforms. And this is so important when it comes to defending democracy, because we see that so much hate speech and disinformation is spread on social media. So the DSA and the DMA are very important first steps. But I think we also here need to really look ahead and see what else is to be done.
Regarding these two legislation, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, how can EU policymakers really design a true digital single markets going farther?
Yeah, I think there is still a lot of digital services that are not harmonized and where there's still fragmentation going on that makes it a little bit more difficult to consumers or even has basically safety gaps for consumers. So I think this is one important point. I think the second issue is that we need to use digitalization much more better for the green transition, but also make sure that with digitalization we don't accelerate climate change. For example, using green energy in the data centers and so on is a very important tool. And then thirdly, I think we need to really start very fast now with the DSA and the DMA implementation. We see with the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk and all the mess it created that starting to implement the DSA very fast and then also see where might be potential gaps and then continue to improve it in the future is important.
And do we have a date for the implementation of these acts?
Yeah, I mean, the Commission is now really basically looking into it and evaluating the different platforms under which category they fall. So there is a transition period of a couple of months, but then it must be implemented.
Okay. You mentioned before the COVID-19 crisis, but what about the Brexit, how it has influenced the single market?
Yeah, for me, it is really still very surprising that the United Kingdom, that was always the biggest defender of the single market and also the biggest fan of the single market, at the end decided to not only leave the European Union, but also the single market, with all the negative implications. If you look at the UK economy, it's not going well. You can really see that businesses, but also citizens, they fight with the red tape, with the customs. It made just life and trade, business much more difficult for the people over there. And GDP growth is going down, trade is going down. So I think with all of that, which is a very sad story, the rest of the European Union basically got more aware of the benefits the single market really brings, because I don't know about you, but sometimes you have something around you, you take it for granted and you don't really value it. But I think, unfortunately, with Brexit, every one of us probably values now a little bit more what we have.
Also, the war in Ukraine has had a significant impact on the business community. So how do you perceive this in relation to the single market?
Yeah, I think also here the single market can be and is the solution to a lot of problems. We know, for example, that most of the experts of SMEs, for example, go to other EU countries, go to the single market. So having short supply chains, exporting to the European Union is a very important factor for our businesses. And this is important when it comes to also interrupted global supply chains to really rely on the single market. Also, for example, when it comes to some raw materials that we were importing from Russia, to make sure that we have a kind of internal market solidarity and see where we need resources where we can get them from in the internal market. I think what we see at the moment, that some member states take a lot of money in their hands in order to support their companies with the energy crisis, is absolutely legitimate, because of course they don't want their companies to go bankrupt, but we see also now an imbalance, a kind of dangerous imbalance in the internal market, and we have to, I think, find common solutions, find European solutions to that.
Apparently, one of the proposals of one of these solutions of the European Parliament is working on is related to the so-called single market instrument, emergency instrument. Why does the European Union need such an instrument, or do you think it needs it?
Yeah, we have seen in the past some crises where supply chains in the European Union got interrupted. We talked about the COVID pandemic already, but there was also a volcano eruption. Imagine any crisis that can happen where naturally member states react in closing borders and looking more inwards. And I think the single market emergency instrument is important to take these lessons learned and see how can we prevent this in the future, how can we keep our single market functioning and benefit more from each other, cooperate more with each other. So that is why I really welcomed the Commission proposal. We start working on this legislative file very soon in the Parliament.
And are there other ways that are possible to do the single market more resilient, or what can the European Parliament do to do the single market more resilient?
For me, but it's probably not really surprising to you because I'm also a green politician, for me resilience has to do a lot also with being resilient against climate change. So I think the more and the faster we advance the green transition and the more we make our internal market a green internal market, the better and the more resilient it is for the supply chains. The more resilient our supply chains will be, the more resilient also our businesses are. And I think for keeping the whole internal market resilient, I think it is important, as I mentioned, to have not a division and not a divergence, but really try to keep all the different EU member states' economies together and not overspend each other, basically.
And indeed, the European economy is undergoing a rapid transition, and with digital technology and climate change needs set to transform the normal trade. So is the European Parliament doing enough, or what is it doing to support this transition? And what is it?
Yeah, I think to support transition, I think you have two options normally. One is rules or regulation, and the other one is subsidies, funds, money. And I think we are doing both on European level. If it is enough, you can probably tell me, or the listeners can tell me, but when it comes to funds, for example, after the corona pandemic, I think to having this common European approach to rebuild our economy was very, very important. And I think we need something similar now, like a more solidaric investment opportunity in the transition in European businesses. We also need for the energy crisis, or to fight the results of inflation. And we also need clear regulation. What a lot of businesses tell me all the time, that they want certainty. They want to know where we are going, what they should invest in. So I think having strong but also clear rules that basically foster the green transformation are very important.
And is the Parliament or the EU policymakers already working in building this legislation for climate change and the green transition?
Yes, I mean, I would say the whole Fit for 55, the Green Deal legislation. We are in my committee especially working on circular economy files to make sure that all products of the future are really designed in a circular way and not in a linear way and can be thrown after 2 years, which is really bad for the environment and for the climate. So these kind of legislation are underway at the moment. But of course, again, as a green politician, I would say it could even go faster and we could be more ambitious, but this is always a democratic process, of course, of different interests.
Going back to the long-awaited common charger, which I guess it's an example of a circular economy as well. Yes. This will be a reality in 2024. Yeah. Could you explain how this will help consumers?
Yeah. The common charger is probably one good example of what I just tried to explain, that you need clear rules, because for 12 years we had a voluntary agreement. So the Commission tried to do a voluntary approach with the companies, but at the end it didn't really work. And now, after 12 years, The Parliament was fighting very much for this. We finally have a solution, and we will have a common EU charter, and it will help the environment because we will save resources, but it will also help the consumers because you don't have to worry about different types of cables you bring and different basically electronic devices you have. It will make all of our lives much easier.
So what about how can the single market encourage productivity and innovation as well? Because we are talking about legislation for businesses in order to go for the, to achieve the transition. But what about production and innovation? Will this be stifled?
Yeah, I mean, you still, because it's such a big market, I guess you have a lot of competition. And I think this automatically also spurs innovation. I think we also have quite good research funds on European level that, of course, also are directed in innovation. And I would say really the majority in this house also has a very strong wish, and we really take care of it that the legislation doesn't hamper innovation. So it has to be clear, but of course it still needs to let innovation to flourish, basically.
Many people in Europe and many of our followers in social media are worried about social inequalities. We received some complaints also about the inflation in our social media post. So what would you say to them? Can the single market help to reduce these social inequalities?
Yeah, from its beginning, I would say the single market and the European integration had a missing social angle. So from the beginning, it was not very clear, like social issues were left to member states and the European Union took care about economic integration. But I also think this is wrong, and this was a mistake in the past years. Also, this Parliament has been fighting for a much, much stronger social dimension of the internal market with specific social rules, like, for example, pay transparency now, or the minimum wage, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think there's at the moment a lot of good and important social rules that had been voted here and that are still under discussion. For when it comes to the inflation, I think what I said before is really important, that we need to take care that all over Europe the member states have the capacity to help their consumers, help their businesses, and not only the richer member states. So we need this, solidaric approach, I would say. Mm-hmm.
So we received some comments from our audience, and some of them say congrats on the 30 years of the single market. And also I would like to read the one from Damian Perez, who says, historical moment for the development of Europe, best decision ever. However, there is another question from Peter on LinkedIn, and he says, do you believe that in the future more problems will arise from a shared international currency in combination with varying national constitutions and policy?
With an international currency?
Yes, from a shared international currency in combination with different national policies.
Probably this question refers to the euro crisis that we had some years ago, where we really saw, okay, the common currency, the euro that we are having, is putting some constraints on, for example, devaluation capacities of member states. And if you're in a crisis like Greece, it was like really difficult to devalue your money because you're in the euro. I think back then it was a really horrible time, and it also really showed the weaknesses of the system. And I think some of the policy changes we did since then improved the situation. But I would say that we are still not finished. For me, a proper European economic governance would be basically the solution, but we are not there yet. But with the discussion on the future of the EU, I think this also had come back again.
And what alternatives does Europe have to compete against some foreign companies which are normally supported or regularly supported by state funding?
Yeah, what we decided in this house a couple of months ago is a so-called anti-subsidy instrument. So when basically countries like Okay, I can just name the country. If countries like China pay a lot of subsidies to their state-owned companies and then basically also compete here on the internal market, we now have some tools in our hand to basically not undermine our companies, but have like really a fair competition and fight this unfair competition that is probably started by China, but potentially also by some other countries.
To sum up, thanks to the single market, we live, love, study and work all over Europe, across borders. So how could citizens' cross-border rights could be improved or strengthened further?
Very important, because for me, I have to say, the most important part of the European Union and also of the single market is the citizens. At the end, everything we do, everything we try to achieve, it's for the sake of citizens. So yeah, citizens' rights are really, really, really important. And there is big and small measures. One I find small, but also really, really important. One of my green colleagues is working on it. It is a statute for basically European associations, that if citizens from both sides of the border, they want to found an association, they can just do it, because at the moment this is quite difficult. So there's still very, very important small and bigger steps where we can improve basically the rights of EU citizens.
Perfect. So, Ms. Cavazzini, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure to have you here, and thank you to all our followers for tuning in once again. Have a good evening, and yeah, have a good evening as well.
Thank you.